Links to previous episodes are given in the video description, so don't forget to like, subscribe and share the video. The War Bride's Oath. Episode 6. The reason Cecilia hadn't resisted the pull was simply out of sheer surprise and confusion. The room had been in the dark just before, and she had barely realized what was going on nor where she was being dragged to. It only took a matter of seconds to. Opening a door on the side of the room, Ashen pulled her with him onto the balcony circling the banquet hall. They were on one of the high towers of the castle, and aside from the main doors the guests had come in and out from, and the small door behind the throne, all the other doors on the side led to that very balcony. It wasn't the best weather to be outside in. The storm was loud above them, and the clouds dark. A rainfall had begun, landing big droplets on them and threatening to inundate the little balcony in seconds if it wasn't for the draining system. Cecilia didn't care much about the tempestuous weather, though. The cause of her distress was the man who had dragged her there. She glared at him the second she realized it was Ashen. When he felt they were far enough from the door, both of them barely protected against the stone wall, Ashen turned around to face her. Cecilia suddenly turned her wrist and broke herself free in one movement, taking him by surprise. It was one brutal, quick gesture that showed her annoyance at him, but Ashen didn't protest, only pulling his hand back with a sullen expression. "Sorry about that," he muttered. "I needed to talk to you alone." Unsatisfied, Cecilia crossed her arms and looked away from him, at the waves crashing against the rocks below. She clearly had no intention to make this easy for him. "Listen. I don't want us to fight, Cecilia. I missed you. I never even thought that you'd come back, and now that you're here, you ignoring me is torture. Do you have any idea how many men were staring at you, while you purposely won't even let me look at you? I'm barely keeping myself from murdering my own men for that." She didn't even react to his words or his pleading eyes. Ashen slowly realized it was all his fault. He never thought for even a moment that it would be harder to look upon her face, while she was still giving him the cold shoulder. Cecilia's icy gaze was directed at the sea, refusing to look at him, and yet, he couldn't bring himself to be mad at her, not even for a second. She was beautiful. The most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and it wasn't just about her physical appearance. It was in the way she appeared both strong and fragile, fearless but shy. The way the rain slowly ran down her curls he was dying to brush with his hands. Her pale lips, her slender cheeks, her green gaze, cold like an emerald. Something in him was screaming to hold her, right now, but he was holding on to his last strings of willpower not to cross that dangerous line. He sighed and brushed his white hair back, glancing at the window behind her, showing the room inside still in the dark. "Cecilia, I know I've treated you too harshly. I was so confused after I had thought I'd never see you again. I directed my anger at you, and I shouldn't have. I've thought about this often. I knew it would have been reckless to bring you to war with me. Those 2 years were the best of my life, and brutally, your father rejected me and chased me away, back into my own kingdom still torn apart by civil war. I was barely 17, and I had just gotten back on my feet. Can you even understand how painful that was for me? I was scared, confused, and angry. I felt like I was given hope, only to have it all crushed again. I considered your family my own, and you all welcomed me so warmly too. I never wanted to leave, Cecilia. I would have never wanted to leave, but your father didn't even give me that choice. Anger appeared in his expression again, and he glared at the wall behind her, clenching his fists at the memory. He was shaking, not because of the cold but because of how painful that memory was. The feelings of that time were all coming back, too hard to endure. Ashen made sure not to direct his ice-cold gaze at Cecilia, but even so, the princess wasn't looking at him. She seemed to be hearing him while trying not to listen and refused to move or look his way. They were standing less than 2 steps away from one another, they were too close for her not to hear him. His large body was partially shielding her from the rain that had intensified, and the wind that was whipping his skin. Ashen's white hair was floating around his face, while Cecilia's curls were still down, barely moving as no breeze reached her. She was both shielded and cornered. Ashen scoffed bitterly. You probably don't even know what happened that night. I knew your mother had noticed my feelings toward you, but as always, she trusted me. I was always aware I shouldn't have loved you, but I couldn't help it. Our age difference was driving me insane, so I pretended not to see you were feeling the same, for as long as I could. Somehow, I had this hope that as you grew older, we would finally be free to love each other. It became real torture over time. The older you got, the more beautiful you became. I knew my own feelings for you had grown from innocent fondness to love, and as you started to look more and more like a woman, it just became too hard to pretend not to see it. When you began to show you were loving me back, I felt like the gods were trying to tear me apart. As if to emphasize his words, the storm thundered loudly above their heads. The rain was starting to pour now, and Ashen moved closer to Cecilia, trapping her between him and the castle's wall. He meant to shield her from the downpour, but she was pinned under him, and it was harder to avoid his burning gaze on her. She was regretting that low cut in her back, and trying to stay away from the cold stone behind her. Just then, Ashen sighed, and in a swift movement, undid his fur cape to place it on her shoulders. Cecilia tried to take it off, but as soon as her hand grabbed it over her shoulder, Ashen's fingers caught it. This time, she glared back at him, not avoiding his dark eyes anymore. The king didn't seem to mind at all. His eyes were on her, and he resumed talking, strangely calm for once. I would have never, ever touched you when you were that young, Cecilia. When we kissed for the first time, I understood that. Rather than unleashing my desire, it gave me the power to restrain it. For you. I knew I could wait for as long as it took, but I never thought your father wouldn't trust me. By now, the rain was running down his drenched hair and face and had begun to drip down Cecilia's too. Still, his hand was hot over hers, and grabbing it tightly despite the sharp scales. He didn't want to let go, and wouldn't. She had stopped fighting him, but her eyes went away from his again, her lips pinched together in a bitter expression. That memory wasn't just painful for him. That night, when Cray found us outside of the Onyx Castle, and Cashin took you home, I thought they'd just be mad at me for taking you out late. But your father and Darson dragged me to the border. They told me to leave the Empire, and to never approach you again. He released her hand, clenching his fists by his side, overtaken by anger again. He shook his head, visibly furious. I begged them, Cecilia. I begged your father and brother 1,000 times to let me back in, to forgive me. I swore I had never touched you, and I would never touch you until you were an adult. I had even thought I'd wait till your 17th birthday, just like the age your parents got together. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. Several, even, trying to calm himself down. I swear I'm not mad at you. I knew there was no way you'd come, but I still waited. I waited for days, hoping to see you, and at the same time, a part of me didn't want you to meet me there. I knew you'd be too young to follow me to my kingdom when you had only known the peace of your family's empire. So I left. I left, with my anger and my rancor, and I used it to fuel my desire to reconquer this place. It's still a work in progress, but I got rid of so many people who were aligned with my father, and those who opposed me. I'll soon be the king of a peaceful kingdom, and then, I'll truly be able to show your father he was wrong about me. He had almost shouted that last sentence, and when he realized that, his eyes went to the side, where the nearest window was. No one seemed to have heard, though. Luckily, the walls and tinted windows were thick, and with the raging storm above them, most of his words were blown away by the wind. Cecilia was the only one there to hear him, but the princess' expression remained as cold and still as a statue. It wasn't as if she didn't listen, she simply didn't care what he had to say. She kept ignoring him, putting that invisible but thick wall between them. This vision broke Ashen. Don't you have anything to say? He muttered. She turned her eyes back to him, and for a second, his heart was filled with hope that she'd talk, finally, but his hope was cut short. Cecilia stared blankly, and suddenly, the vision of her expression when he had told her to shut up hit him like a slap. He had done this. She had tried to talk, and he had dismissed her, twice. Now, he was willing to talk, but she didn't want to anymore. He was reaping what he sowed, and it was those cold, green eyes on him. It wouldn't have been so hard to endure if she hadn't looked so beautiful in that instant. She was like a goddess under the rain and storm, not fearing him, not allowing him anything. She seemed so fragile and so small in front of him, yet he knew he had already lost to her. He couldn't win, not when he loved her so much, so painfully. Not when she had that cold mix of anger and resentment in her eyes. Not when he was the one who had broken that bridge she had desperately tried to build between them, after all this time. It was his fault. Cecilia, I'm sorry, he muttered, stepping closer. She backed against the wall, and a faint dash of pink appeared on her cheeks. She was suddenly desperate to avoid his gaze, but she couldn't hide her reactions well. There was still something between them, something that made them warm despite the cold and driving rain. Ceci, I'm really sorry. Her lower lip twitched, and for a second, with all those drops running down her face, it looked as if she was crying. Perhaps she really was, but it was hard to tell. Ashen took a deep breath and leaned down to kiss her. It was a passionate, almost forceful kiss. However, for the first 2 or 3 seconds, Cecilia didn't resist it. She responded to it, even. In that very brief moment, the passion between them ignited like a burning fire. Their lips acted on their own, left to their own desires. It wasn't like the innocent kiss of their younger years. This one was full of passion, thirst, and even some rage. They didn't breathe, just kissing wildly for the handful of seconds it lasted. Cecilia brutally snapped out of it. So brutally, she slapped him with the back of her hand, furious and glaring at him for kissing her like that. She was angry he had dared to take her by surprise, and angrier she hadn't resisted it earlier. Shaken up, Ashen was brutally slapped back to reality. He took a step back, and his fingers touched his cheek, feeling the two small cuts. Cecilia's scales had scratched him. It was involuntary, and in fact, he didn't care at all for that injury. He was much more hurt by how violently she was rejecting him, and glaring at him. This made him angry too. You just felt that too. You don't hate me, Cecilia, you still love me, so why do you do this to me? What do I have to do for you to speak, and be honest? He was running out of patience, but so was the princess. Using her two hands, she pushed him off of her, finally putting some distance between their bodies. She looked really upset this time, and kept her hands up between them, as if to prevent him from coming near again. Cecilia! Don't ever do that again, she painfully muttered with a hoarse voice. Despite what she said, hearing her speak to him again brought a wave of relief to Ashen. He nodded faintly, but he knew she really was angry. He had rarely seen her angry before, but Cecilia was almost as scary as her father when she was mad, and he'd rather not do that to her again. If he had hoped they could talk again, he was mistaken. She pushed him away from her and began to move to walk back inside, keeping her hands wrapped around herself. She visibly didn't dare to touch his fur cape around her, although she wouldn't take it off either. Cecilia, he insisted, dying to grab her wrist again and have her stay there. She stopped her steps, but she was already turned away from him, leaving Ashen to stare at her back again. I meant it, he continued. I'm sorry. And I'm not mad at you. Can we talk? Not here, but... Cecilia turned her head, just enough that he could see her eye glaring at him between her drenched locks. We'll talk when you're done feeling sorry just for yourself. Those words took Ashen by surprise, and he didn't react to it fast enough to prevent her from leaving again. He wanted to call her again and quickly tried to think of something to say. Your scales. Cecilia stopped again, just a couple of steps away from the door. This time, though, she didn't look back. Ashen took a deep breath. They weren't black before. Ceci's scales weren't dark. Cecilia, what happened to your dragon? He saw her shoulders quickly rise from her breathing, but it might have been due to the storm and the wind blowing against her body. She was hesitating, but before Cecilia could answer, the door she was trying to get to slowly opened. Gisel's appearance cut their conversation short. His mistress stood there, carrying an umbrella and a towel, glancing at the two of them. Despite Cecilia glaring at her, the redhead kept her usual mischievous smile on, unfazed. Then, Cecilia directed her glare at Ashen and stormed off, angrily walking past his mistress. Cecilia walked back into the hall drenched, upset, and very disturbed. Luckily, another number was going on in the middle of the banquet, and despite the storm raging, no one seemed to notice her but Yusum, who hurried to her from a few steps away, visibly worried. "My lady," he whispered. "You're completely drenched. Are you all right?" "Ceci, what the heck?" Tessa appeared behind him. "You were outside in that storm." For a few seconds, she couldn't speak, completely disoriented. Her head felt a bit dizzy, and she just shook it, her voice too tight to speak. During that time, Yasim's eye fell on the fur cloak on her shoulders, and he glanced toward the throne, where the king was also coming back to his seat. Just like the princess, he was drenched and sat quietly with a sullen expression. "Yasim, is there a room where we can take a break?" Tessa muttered. "I think Ceci could use a break, and a dry towel or two." "No." Cecilia pushed her cousin's hand away and directed her eyes to the center of the banquet hall, where another one of the candidates was bowing to the crowd. "Yasim, please introduce me. I want to do my performance now." "Are you sure, my lady?" Yasim asked, a bit worried. "You're completely drenched." "Yes." "Now." Yasim and Tessa exchanged a look, but they could tell the princess was set on her decision. Not only that, but she was wearing the king's fur cape he had on previously, and they could roughly guess something had happened between the two. Despite the entertainment provided by another one of the candidates in the middle of the room, it was clear the king's absence hadn't gone unnoticed, and now, more glances were going their way, trying to make sense out of the drenched princess' short absence. Some were whispering and not even trying to conceal their suspicious stares, even when Tessa glared back. Perhaps it was indeed better for her cousin to take a stance now. "Fine," muttered Tessa. "I was getting bored of this show anyway. We might as well provide the entertainment ourselves." Above them, the sounds of thunder got louder, and a few worried glances went to the windows, the rain pelting against the glass. The storm was getting worse outside, and some servants quietly went to check the doors to the balcony, the same ones Cecilia had just come back from, to make sure they would hold. It was clear no one could go outside now. Nobody in the room would have considered it anyway. Instead, they were all absorbed in the foreigner's strange appearance, and the way her body slowly moved toward the center of the banquet hall. Despite being drenched, Cecilia had lost none of her beauty, and if anything, the droplets running down her dress made it even shinier. The fur cloak she had kept on was also gathering some attention, with some people glancing the king's way before going back to her. Cecilia wasn't looking at any of them, though. Instead, she had her eyes on the floor, as if she deliberately avoided staring at anyone, and kept walking until she found herself in the center of the room. Only then did she finally raise her head to glance at the audience. "Introducing Lady Cecilia, Imperial Princess of the Dragon Empire," said Yasim's voice behind her, loud enough for all to hear. "First daughter of the war god and water goddess." "Most of you already know who I am," said Cecilia. "A stutterer," shouted one of the candidates with a smirk. Cecilia immediately glared back, her green eyes glowing with a fire this time. The woman who had spoken tried not to act scared, crossing her arms with a smirk on, but she still took a couple of steps back. She was the one who had performed just before, but Cecilia hadn't met this one yet. Perhaps she was related to one of the other girls. This was their first time seeing each other, so this woman had simply decided to insult her in the open, showing that Cecilia was not welcome there. She wasn't alone. Several chuckles and whispers were heard throughout the room, showing their unspoken support. However, this wasn't enough to intimidate Cecilia. Even Tessandra behind her smirked. "I do stutter," Cecilia retorted, "but that's not all there is to know about me." She took a step forward, staring at the audience as if she was daring anyone to speak up again. Despite her appearance, there was definitely an aura of power around her. Because she was taller than most women and also wearing heels, she easily dominated the room. Cecilia took the time to glance all around the room, as if she wanted to remember each face. "It is true, I am a daughter of the Dragon Empire. I am the Empress niece and the War God's daughter, but here, I am only a foreigner who came to take the title of Chu Queen." She stepped to the side to glance at the people who were behind her previously. No one dared to speak up anymore, they were all absorbed by her deep voice and the confidence that radiated through her. Cecilia slowly moved her shoulders, making the fur cape fall from its resting place and land at her feet. She was looking in the opposite direction of the king, but unlike her, many people stared toward their monarch. "You asked the candidates to display their talents here. If your goal is to find someone who can be worthy of becoming this kingdom's queen, then I will show you how serious I am about this." She stepped on the fur coat, and raised her hands, showing her scales for all to see. Several people gasped in awe or fear. Perhaps some of them hadn't realized what was covering her skin or had mistaken it for fabric or makeup. Right now, though, it was impossible to be mistaken any longer. The dark scales were very visible under the lights, even more so whenever Cecilia moved. Each time she wiggled her fingers, the scales would move along to follow her movement, showing they were genuine. As if it wasn't enough, she rubbed her palm against her stomach, where the thousands of little pieces of glass had been sewn into the fabric. Her thick scales against the glass generated a sharp, high-pitched sound that made many people grimace. "Just like everyone in my family, I was born with the dragon's blood. My body is different from yours. I can heal faster. I am naturally stronger too." "This is ridiculous," scoffed the candidate from earlier. "So you have snake skin? Dragons may be real, but they have no power here, foreigner. You can't show off if you have nothing to back up your claim. This is not a talent befitting a real queen." Cecilia immediately turned her head toward her. "I have more power than you," Cecilia retorted, glaring back at that woman. "I am getting tired of you underestimating me because you don't know me. You think I am weak because I stutter. You think you're better because you can sing or dance. You think you can hurt me and scare me into going back." Above their heads, the sky suddenly thundered as if to support her words. Many people turned their scared eyes toward the sky, but Cecilia and the candidate were still glaring at each other. "You're all show," spat the other candidate. "You and your friend have been acting as if you are above everyone else, haven't you? Do you think anyone would want a queen from a country that oppressed us? You attacked the Dragon Empire," scoffed Tessa. "You came looking for a fight, and against the Dragon Empire's war god, no less. What, were you expecting to be sent home with gifts, perhaps? You guys are nothing without your dragons," the candidate shouted back. "It's easy to win a war when you have the most dangerous predator in this world at your service." Cecilia's eyes went beyond the candidate's shoulder, glaring at Ashen. The king knew right away what she meant to say. He had mentioned the very same thing, just before. That with her father's dragon, his war to claim back his kingdom would have been over in a matter of days. Ironically, it was one of his own citizens that was speaking against that idea right now. Cecilia didn't even have to do anything. She even faintly smiled, turning back to the brazen woman. "It's true," she said. "Things are easier when you have a dragon. Wars are easy to win. But some battles can't be won on open ground, can they?" Just as she said that, another loud noise from outside took the audience by surprise. This time, they weren't so sure it was the thunder. Some strange noises were coming from all over the roof, sounds that didn't seem to quite match the storm outside. Not only that, but after a few more seconds of sending worried glances all around, a few people noticed how some windows seemed now strangely shielded from the rain that was still pouring on others. "I didn't come here to play," continued Cecilia, ignoring them. "I did not come to play petty games with other girls. I came here because this country needs a queen." "You sound arrogant to me," hissed Safia this time, not far from the other candidate. "Aren't you the one parading around with all that gold? What happened, princess? Ready to buy our kingdom with all of your daddy's gold? It must sound familiar to you," Tessandra retorted, "and unlike yours, the gold we wear, we own ourselves. I guess working and earning your own money must still be quite a strange concept for a lazy bee, Tessa," Cecilia said, raising her hand to cut her off. Her cousin clicked her tongue with annoyance, still glaring at Safia. "I don't care for my gold," said Cecilia. "Money can be earned again. I came here ready to use it in your kingdom anyway. What I did not expect to find was that the people here are so scared of my gold they would dare rob me. Rob me, and try to hurt me with so many glass shards, hidden in my clothes. Like cowards. We are not scared of you," Safia shouted back. "You should be." Just then, a loud growl was very clearly heard from above. Many people screamed in fear, others froze. This time, there was no doubt. That was no thunder, but the growl of a very, very large creature that moved on the roof around them. Safia and the other candidate looked terrified the most. Their eyes kept going around to see where the creature was, spotting movement behind the colored glass. "It can't be," muttered the other candidates. "We already know women of the Dragon Empire don't have dragons." "You might want to revise your old books," scoffed Tessandra. "Things have changed a lot in the last couple of decades. The daughters of the war god don't just have the dragon blood, they all have dragons now." She didn't need to mention Cray wasn't Cecilia's dragon, but her father's. If Cecilia didn't mention it herself, there was probably no need to say it. Instead, Tessandra crossed her arms, watching the audience, ready to intervene if anyone tried to attack Cecilia. It wouldn't be necessary, though. All eyes had gone from the princess to the ceiling, most of them absolutely terrified. Although there had been word that a dragon had been spotted in the sky recently, Cray had indeed remained out of most people's sights, and the few who had actually thought the information was real probably thought it had only come here to drop off the princess, and gone home right away. They couldn't have been more wrong. You can't have a dragon here," Safia screeched. "It will murder us all." "No, said Cecilia, very calmly. Not unless I ask it to. That was the most frightening sentence to hear. All terrified eyes went to the princess, suddenly realizing this woman yielded much more power than she looked to possess. Those who had found her beautiful now found her terrifying, and those who had found her pitiable with her stutter now found her imposing. They didn't have time to admire her any longer, though. From somewhere above, one of the windows suddenly burst open, shards of glass raining down on the banquet. Luckily, the few people nearby had time to run away before they were stabbed, and only the table below was covered in glass. Cecilia had done nothing to prevent this, which was clearly some form of warning as well as retaliation. With the window broken open, the wind blew inside the room, blowing out most of the candles. The room turned even darker than before, but there was one bright light nobody missed. A bright red eye appeared at the window, glancing down at all the small humans in there. Don't scream! In fact, many people's cries died in their throats with Cecilia's warning. They wanted to scream in terror, try and run away, but now that she had said not to, everyone was scared of what would happen if they did, leaving many with their mouths open and a strange grimace stuck on their faces. No one dared to move. Cecilia was the only one who slowly walked there. To many people's surprise, she kicked her heels off, and stepped fearlessly on the broken glass on the floor, and as her skirt floated around her legs, the black scales could be seen again, covering her feet more safely than any pair of shoes. The princess walked until she was under the window, and while glancing up at the dragon's large red eye, she smiled. "Give them to me now, please." Another growl was heard, loud enough to have even the bravest people shiver in utter fear. Then, obeying her, the dragon moved up. Its body could be seen rubbing against the opening, the large black scales scrolling endlessly for several seconds. They could easily guess the size of that creature from the noises made all around the ceiling. Finally, something that looked like a reptilian paw appeared, its sharp claws holding onto something. Cray threw it inside with one movement. The two things rolled on the floor, and in the darkness, it took the people a few seconds to realize. "Bodies!" someone screamed. "They are still alive," announced Tessandra, "at least for now." "These are the men who ransacked our room," declared Cecilia, loudly. "The only reason they are alive is because I know there was someone who commanded them to do it." Indeed, the two men appeared to be breathing and still alive, but even then they were in a less than enviable state. Both were covered in blood, their clothes and bodies looking to have been deeply lacerated in multiple areas, most likely from the dragon's rough handling. The two men were unconscious, dirty, and looked poorly dressed. Even without more explanation, it was clear the only reason those bandits would have dared to commit a crime in the royal castle was under someone's orders. Many people exchanged glances, curious as to what she was going to do with those people. You have no proof, anyway," said Safia, her voice shaking. "Even if those people talk, you might have scared them to say any name." "Thank you for the advice, Lady of." "What was it, the Yekara clan?" retorted Tessandra with a smirk. Safia went white, as did many of the people who had been around her all this time. She was clearly regretting opening her mouth at this very moment. However, Cecilia's green eyes went to her without any anger in them. The princess' calmness was dominating the room. "I didn't plan to interrogate them," said Cecilia. "This is a warning to their masters. You all wanted to see it, didn't you? My performance tonight is exactly this. I am a daughter of the Dragon Empire. This is the last time you underestimate me. I will not let you get away with it next time." Just as she finished her sentence, Tessandra moved forward and swung her sword twice. Swish! Swish! The blade just shone once in the air before the blood flew. It splattered Safia's dress, and something landed at the candidate's feet. She screamed at the sight of the freshly cut hand. "That one's for hurting our friend," said Tessandra. "Next time, I'm sending you their heads." Safia's hysterical screams covered most of her words though. Tessandra shrugged, and cleaned her blade calmly, while the audience around them was still rendered utterly speechless. Everyone was now genuinely terrified of those two young women, almost more than they were of the dragon above their heads. King Ashen was the only one to stare with excitement in his eyes. His fists clenched, his body forward, and his hectic breathing, his chest was going up and down as if he had just witnessed a show he was incredibly proud of and excited about. He was almost off his throne to go and run to her, but Cecilia wasn't looking. Suddenly, someone began to clap in the audience. A bit shocked, eyes looked around for who had the guts to be applauding the princess at this moment, until they spotted her. Giselle. In the crowd, she was smiling from ear to ear, staring at the princess and clapping slowly, in total disruption of the atmosphere in the room. She almost looked a bit crazy to be clapping like this, as if this was just a nice show. Then, Bastet began to clap too, followed by another anonymous candidate. One by one, a few people found the strength to applaud, but it fell a bit flat, a bit out of place, especially when the princess glared at the king's mistress like that. "Your Highness! Your Highness!" The strident voice coming from the main door seemed to wake everyone up from a very strange nightmare. All eyes turned to the doors, where a young servant suddenly ran into the banquet room, disregarding everyone there, and threw herself at the feet of the king. "My king! A murder! There was a murder!" "What?" hissed the king, jumping to his feet. "Lady Vina of the Pangaha clan was found dead. Someone murdered her." Many panicked whispers rose in the room, but Giselle's chuckle came to Cecilia's ears. "Oh my, I did not think this banquet would be that interesting. I'm glad I came after all." The king's mistress was the only one enjoying herself there. Everyone else was in shock, and several people, most likely from the Pangaha clan, let out loud cries and screams. "My king, it can't be," shouted an older man. "Wasn't she here just a while ago?" frowned Axelane, the candidate from the Nahaf family. "What happened?" asked Ashen, glaring down at the servant. "Speak." I just left the lady for a few minutes to go and get her some water, but when I came back, I found my poor lady dead in her room, lying in so much blood. Someone violently stabbed her multiple times, my king, it was a murder." "Guards!" the king shouted. "Guard the doors to this hall, no one comes in and no one leaves until my return." He angrily stormed off, briefly glancing at Cecilia on his way out. It was a brief, fleeting moment that lasted less than a second when their eyes met. Cecilia tried to look away, but it was already too late. After a slight hesitation, she turned her gaze to stare at Ashen's back as he left the room, then at the doors after they were closed behind him. Even after the king's departure, things were chaotic in the hall. Many women were crying, and some men were angrily shouting, some trying to convince the royal guards to let them leave the room to go see Vina's body as well. In the midst of this, Cecilia sighed faintly and picked up the fur cloak she had previously taken off. She softly brushed it, making sure no little shards of glass were on it. Meanwhile, Nana quietly walked up to her and Tessandra, the counselors behind her, visibly scared too. "I can't believe she was really killed. That there's a murderer in the castle," Nana muttered, her lips trembling. "No one mentioned the murderer had to be human," said the candidate from before. "Lady Ashra, I suggest you measure your words," Bastat calmly declared. Cecilia suddenly realized that candidate was the one they had seen with Giselle previously, along with Vina. She hadn't recognized her, since her hairdo and clothes had changed, plus she had only seen that woman briefly from afar. Ashra of the Yekara clan. Just like her cousin Safia, this woman looked arrogant and vain. She shrugged at Bastat's words, crossing her arms with a little smirk. "Did I say anything wrong? The princess just showed off her man-killing beast, did she not? Was I mistaken, that you threatened to murder your enemies? My point is that I will not stoop down to your level," Cecilia retorted. "I don't do things in secrecy, and I don't need to hide what I am capable of. I won't lower myself or put on a play to make you satisfied." "That's one rare skill around here," scoffed another candidate, one of the other two that hadn't been introduced yet. "Most ladies here play nice in public and hide their claws. For someone to act the opposite is one change I'd like to see happen." From her skin that was a shade slightly paler than most people in the room, and how she seemed to be among the rare candidates to respect her, Cecilia guessed she was Ishara, the candidate of the Hashit family. Dressed in a long, indigo blue dress, she bowed politely to the princess as their eyes met, confirming her pacific intentions. "Already ready to follow in the princess' shadow, Hashit," scoffed Safia. "So typical of your clan of cowards. You're the one who should watch it," Ishara hissed back. "We're only speaking the truth. Moreover, the princess left the room earlier, didn't she? I saw her leave, just a while before Vina was murdered. Why would she leave the banquet at all, when we weren't done presenting ourselves, and plus, to return afterward? Her room isn't so far, either. It's only facts. She had the time, and a motive to kill Vina, didn't she? One less candidate, wouldn't you have been relieved to take that eyesore out of your way?" "Lady Safia," protested Naptuni, furious. "How dare you make such accusations? Lady Cecilia is innocent, she only left for a short while, and why would she kill Lady Vina?" "Who knows?" shrugged Safia, visibly amused to have everyone's attention, and to sow some doubt around. "Perhaps the princess thinks this whole competition isn't worth the trouble." "It's not the trouble to murder someone either," said Cecilia, annoyed. "I don't need to lie or cheat. Unlike some people we know," scoffed Tessandra. "How dare you accuse us of cheating? You're welcome to return our gold anytime, then. Don't you play Miss Righteous with us any longer. First, our room was ransacked, and now another candidate was killed. How much dirtier is this going to get? She has a point, said Bastet, crossing her arms. None of the clans will follow a queen that gets her way with tricks, lies, and murders. Lady Cecilia may have brought a dragon, but she also proved she didn't need one. How is that? Shouted Safia. What can she do without her dragon, then? Are you by any chance blind? Said Ishra, sighing. Her hands are like this because she manipulated glass to make herself a dress after her belongings were vandalized. It takes courage to purposely injure yourself, even if you have great healing abilities. Not only that, but she sent a warning rather than an act of revenge, and she bested us all in showing her abilities, those she used and those she didn't. You can't claim Princess Cecilia's efforts were for naught, unless you really want to act blind. Oh, and please spare us your usual dramatic shock. Do not pretend, you were all gloating about how she would have nothing to wear tonight. Seems like you were quite off the mark. Safia's mouth opened and closed several times, completely in shock at how Ishra had just defended Cecilia. She clenched her fists, humiliated like a child. I only heard it from the servants. And it doesn't prove she had nothing to do with Vina's murder. Or are you also going to pretend she couldn't have done it? You all saw her leave too. Tessandra glared around, but this time, none of the candidates spoke up in their favor. Bastet and Ishra turned their heads, visibly deciding to ignore Safia's claim or pay attention any longer. The other candidates were exchanging looks, either smiling at the idea of cornering the dragon princess, or simply curious as to what was to unfold next. In fact, while they waited for the king's return, the whole audience seemed captivated by the fight between the beautiful ladies present. They were all whispering in low voices, unwilling to take part themselves but happy to witness. Behind the two candidates of the Yekara clan, many people were glaring at the princess, or whispering about how she could have murdered Vina. The only people invested were those who had been crying since earlier, Vina's people, the Pangaha clan. Their other candidate, Istis, had red eyes, but was visibly holding it in. Instead, she glared at Cecilia, stepping forward. Don't you have anything to say for yourself, princess? She said. You should at least explain where you were. Cecilia stared at her, unwilling to speak. She took a deep breath in and slowly shook her head. I did not kill her. Nor order anyone to do so. That doesn't tell us where you were, shouted Ashra, a snarky smile on. Could it be you have no one to take your defense, princess? No witness to confirm wherever you went? Isn't it odd, for someone always stuck with the Duro-safe girl and that boyish woman? Next to Cecilia, Nana furiously clenched her fists, stepping forward, but Tessandra raised her hand, and faintly shook her head, telling her to stay back. Instead, Yasam stepped forward. Lady Ashra, you should not. Shut up, old man. I'm not talking to you. I'm talking to the princess. You stutter, but you should at least be able to say something for yourself. No. That won't be necessary. The calm voice took everyone by surprise. With a faint smile on her face, Giselle stepped forward, her hands behind her back and an innocent look on. She was the last person they had all expected to speak up right then. In fact, most had completely forgotten her presence at all. She had been waiting in the shadows all this time, only to come out now. It was clear the king's mistress was amused by the situation. Even Ashra and Safia exchanged a stunned look. The redhead put her fingers to her lips, smiling at them, a smile that didn't foreshadow anything good. "I'm impressed," she said loud enough for all to hear. "His Majesty is gone, yet so many young ladies are eager to acquire justice themselves." "That's not it," declared Safia, frowning. "We were merely asking questions." "Really? I thought you were almost going to murder the princess here and now. Or at least, scratch her face or something. I am a bit disappointed." Everyone was shocked by her words, but there definitely was a hint of truth in them. They had been quite ruthless. Giselle chuckled at their stunned faces. "Do you have something to say?" asked Safia, impatient. Cecilia noted how, unlike her cousin, Ashra had gone carefully silent right now, her eyes on the redhead. It was as if she had forgotten Cecilia to focus on Giselle instead, with something more complex, like fear in her eyes. "I do," said Giselle. "The princess is innocent, I will vouch for her." "What now?" exclaimed Tessa, raising her eyebrows. Cecilia was just as confused. However, Giselle smiled at her briefly, before turning to Safia again. "There, you have it. You wanted a witness, didn't you? I saw where she went and when she came back. She did not kill Lady Vina. But... are you doubting my words?" Giselle's question held more threat than it seemed. Safia glanced toward her cousin, but seeing how passive Ashra had gotten, she swallowed her saliva, and possibly her pride. "Fine." However, Cecilia wasn't fine. She wasn't happy with having Giselle stand up for her, of all people. She didn't understand why that woman had done that. Giselle smiled, visibly satisfied with the candidates dropping the whole subject, and slowly walked up to Cecilia. Around them, no one dared to make loud comments anymore, and seemingly, the people from each tribe were talking between themselves, most likely about the murder. Hence, with most people forgetting about them, she freely approached Cecilia. Her eyes went to the fur cloak on the princess' shoulders, and she chuckled. "I've seen that ugly thing somewhere. I didn't need your help." "I know. But I figured you wouldn't want to let the others know about what had really happened earlier. Am I wrong?" Cecilia remained silent, refusing to give in to her questions. Giselle chuckled. "So stubborn, princess. That must come from your father, the war god. If your mother is like most of the long-lost Rain tribe, she is probably more flexible." Cecilia and Tessandra exchanged a look. Although they had suspected it all this time, it was quite odd to hear Giselle mention the Rain tribe. The redhead noticed and tilted her head. "Oh, please. You must have realized, right? You and I are probably distant relatives or something. Our mothers had told us most of the Rain tribe was gone." "Gone, or captured," said Giselle. "After all, your mothers were made slaves, weren't they? A concubine and a prostitute." Tessandra's eyes opened wide, and her hand went to her sword. Cecilia reacted fast, grabbing her wrist before she pulled it out. Tessandra's hand froze, but she still glared at the mistress. How much do you know about my mother? She hissed. Just a little, Giselle shrugged. When the news spread that the war god's woman was white-skinned, it got some attention even on this side of the border. The few who had survived the onslaught on the Rain tribe tried to find out more, naturally. The women who had been made slaves, like my own mother. I guess not everyone could have a beautiful ending, though. She lived and died a slave, like most of those who had been captured. A handful lived long enough to be free again or bear the children of their masters. The Hashid family has a few of those, as well, you must have heard. She sighed and glanced toward the little group behind Ishra. Curiously, among all the people present there, they were those who seemed to be glancing their way the most. Even more surprising, they didn't seem nearly ready to approach, some of them glaring at Giselle. They don't seem fond of you, noted Tessandra. No. But not many people are, I would say. It's one of the privileges of being the king's mistress. Most people want you dead, or in their bed. She turned to the Hashid family and smiled at them suddenly, which made those people uncomfortable, and they all stopped staring. Giselle scoffed. Cowards, most of them. How did you get in the king's bed, then? Muttered Tessandra. I was lucky. Someone left that spot empty. Cecilia drew out Tessandra's sword with one movement. The blade flew in the air, so quickly and swiftly, no one but Tessa realized at first. She stopped it 1 inch away from Giselle's neck, her green eyes glaring at the young woman with murderous intent. Even worse, Giselle smiled and tilted her head. You could, you know. I'm sure no one would cry. Absolutely no one, I promise. She seemed to almost be offering her neck, but that only made Cecilia more reluctant to kill that woman. Still, her fingers were shaking on the blade. It might have been even more visible if they weren't covered in scales. Ceci, Nana whispered, a bit worried. Eventually, Tessa raised her hand, and slowly took the sword from Cecilia's hands while the two women were still glaring at each other. Around them, many eyes caught sight of the princess almost killing the king's mistress, and they were all curious as to what was going on. One of the women seemed amused, the other furious. Giselle shrugged. I told you, I am not your enemy. Don't count on us braiding each other's hair either, retorted Tessandra. Oh, I know. However, I don't have anything against you, unlike some of the ladies here. Perhaps you should think twice before making me your enemy. Outside of the room, Cray suddenly growled, making everyone jump, quickly reminded of the dragon's presence. Its ruthless climbing on the building made strange sounds on the stone, and its growls were heard once again. A dragon doesn't share, said Cecilia. Maybe he could learn to. No. This time, the princess turned around, walking toward the main doors and away from the women. She was fed up with all this, and not in a mood to entertain her rival, or any of the others, anymore. Come on, Nana, said Tessandra, gently pulling her to follow. But we're done here. Let's just go back before another Bish decides to annoy the heck out of us. Nana nodded and quickly followed behind Cecilia and Tessa. While the three women were about to head out, Cecilia in front, the doors opened before them again. The king was back. Cecilia briefly raised her eyes, spotting the blood on his hands, and his furious expression. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and she stepped aside, making a visible detour to avoid him. Ashen stopped and watched her leave, even staring at her back until it disappeared in the corridors. Then, his eyes went back in front, spotting his mistress, alone in the center of the room. She crossed her arms again with a little smirk, and turned around, walking toward the broken window. While the storm had quieted down, the dragon outside was still agitated, growling and making a ruckus. Giselle smiled, staring at the black scales through the hole. The war dragon, hey! Another growl sounded, and Cray moved again, its red eye appearing at the window. Many people screamed in fear and stepped farther away, except for Giselle. Her smile disappeared. "Oh, you can tell, can't you? You're not the only monster here." "It's beautiful," Cecilia muttered. She turned the vase in her hands, admiring the beautiful nacre mosaic on it, and how it shined superbly at each fragment of light. She could feel all of the craftsman's hard work and passion in that object, the long hours spent perfecting it. The vase wasn't perfect by any means, but it was beautiful that way. The little stains of the paint that were immortalized made it look like it had just been made. Next to her, Bastet nodded. "You have a good eye, Princess. This one was made by one of our best potters. We attach an importance to objects that go far beyond their monetary value. Sadly, it also means we need to undersell our work." "My mother would love these," said Cecilia. "Do you have a few samples I could send home? I'm sure we could work together on establishing new trades between the Eastern Kingdom and the Dragon Empire. My grandmother is a well-known patron of the arts. I'm sure she would love one of these. It would be our honor to send our best creations for the imperial family to see." Cecilia and Bastet both smiled, and their eyes went back to the amazing display. After the events of the banquet, the king had ended the reception, but the investigation was still ongoing. All the candidates had been proven innocent, since they were attending the banquet at the time of the murder, so now they were free to do as they liked while the royal guards tried to find the culprit, if they could. The rain had continued all the next day, so they had remained in the castle and spent most of the day mending the rest of their ripped dresses and chatting with Nana. In the late afternoon, an invitation came from Bastet, who invited all three of them to visit the arts market, mostly composed of people from the Sesson tribe. Getting out of the castle felt good, after what had happened. Cecilia hadn't seen Ashen since, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. Bastet's invitation had come at the right time. Moreover, Tessandra had decided to go and train with the royal soldiers again, inviting herself to their training grounds, probably for another duel with Nana's brother. Neptune had decided to keep following Cecilia, as she was also curious about the arts market she was unfamiliar with. She had 1,000 questions for Bastet, who was incredibly patient in answering all of them. "Aren't those too fragile for everyday use?" she asked, looking at another one of the pots. "I know the cheapest ones are made of glass or clay, and they are definitely not as pretty, but I would be worried about breaking it." "They are mostly meant for decorative purposes," nodded Bastet, "although our craftsmen have been working on making new ones for more pragmatic uses." "There are materials here I have never seen before," declared Cecilia, "and I am sure there are some we have in the Empire that are not common here." Our craftsmen could work together to bring even better and prettier results. It is my belief, as well, Bastet said with her toneless voice. I am glad Princess Cecilia thinks like us. Despite your presence, I was worried you would be reluctant to trade with our kingdom. I am sorry you weren't properly welcomed here. Last night's banquet was truly unsightly. Neptune pouted her lips, putting down the pot she had in her hands. That's for sure. I can't believe those girls' attitudes. Isn't the Yekara clan overdoing it? Those girls just kept attacking Lady Cecilia any chance they got. They are afraid, said Bastet. Afraid, repeated Cecilia, surprised. The young woman nodded. Today, again, she was wearing a very unusual dress, made of several layers in a motley mix of patterns and colors. Her hairstyle was also just as unique as it was during the banquet, meaning it was probably her personal preference rather than a once-in-a-while kind of appearance. In fact, she was somewhat even more eye-catching today, with layers of colored necklaces around her neck and large rings on her fingers. Although their candidates are trying to act otherwise, the Yekara clan isn't fond of the White King, Bastet slowly nodded. Actually, they were probably happier in times of war, when they could be paid to work as mercenaries or raid cities to take what they wanted. They would pretend to get rid of the criminals, but they also robbed the thieves and demanded compensation for it. That's why they are not very popular, added Nana. All that was just a few years ago, so many of them still behave as if they can do what they want and go unpunished. They got very rich from the years of civil war, but now they are afraid they will go back to just being one of many tribes. Their candidates are probably set on becoming queen no matter what. This way, they will be free to do as they want again, under the pretense of working for the White King. However, no other clan will support that. Since the White King got rid of the Kunu tribe they were allied with, they have to be careful. The women moved on to the next shop, one that displayed a lot of jewelry this time. Neptune immediately jumped on the stall, excited. She had no issues chatting and finding questions to ask the older lady that sold them, happy to chatter and fawn over the little wooden pieces that came in many colors. Cecilia and Bastet stayed a bit behind, neither of them really interested in that stall, only eyeing Nana's movement from a few steps away. The seriousness of their conversation wasn't one they could pursue inside such a little space, so they stood side by side in the little alley. Do you think they are behind Vina's murder? Asked Cecilia. I can't say for sure. However, the Pangaha clan is most likely their biggest threat and main rival. Or so they would both want to believe. In fact, those two probably never consider the other tribes as a real threat. Our kingdom was so fractured that each tribe kept to its own specialty and focused on its own survival for a long time. We all had to become the best in what we did and become essential to the other tribes to survive. The Kunu were killed for opposing the king. Indeed. Just like the Yekara, they weren't fond of times of peace. They were amongst those who waged war against the Dragon Empire too. Their leader publicly defamed the king several times for backing off from the war. They somehow believed it could have been won if we attacked the empire again. Foolish. Really, muttered Cecilia, shocked. We might be separated by a border, but we knew of the previous emperor's death. The Kunu tribe believed an empress with no dragon would have been easier to defeat. Cecilia chuckled. The Kunu tribe couldn't have been more wrong. She could easily imagine her aunt jumping headfirst into the battle despite her advisor's pleas. She would have loved proving the Eastern Kingdom completely wrong about their defenses. Although it wasn't technically her dragon but her late father's, Empress Sherian was the new master of the Golden Dragon, which was still very much alive. The Eastern Kingdom obviously didn't know dragons could outlive their owners. What of the other clan that defied the king? I believe it was the Cheshi clan. Bastet let out a long sigh, slowly crossing her arms. It is hard to tell where their loyalty lies. Unlike the Kunu, the Cheshi were entirely against the war. However, they were also against the former king, and now, they are against the White King too. Many believe our Eastern Kingdom won't be able to really recover or avoid more civil wars until we get a monarch the Cheshi clan approves of. That's surprising. They might be against the king, but they are still waiting to see who he will pick as his queen. Just as she had said that, Bastat's eyes went to Cecilia, with a very serious expression on. She seemed more mature than her age, even though Cecilia now knew Bastat was the oldest of the candidates, and a year older than the king himself. In fact, she realized Bastat could have made a fine queen herself if she had come from the right background. She was very insightful, knowledgeable, and tactful. However, she wasn't the right match, and they both knew it. The way she looked at Cecilia meant she was well aware that the princess was a better candidate than she was. My father allowed me to be the judge of the princess character, so I will say this now. I believe our kingdom needs someone powerful, someone who will genuinely care for each tribe, and someone who will try to heal our nation from the inside without ignoring any wound. Counselor Yasum isn't called the wise for nothing. The fact that he brought you, the daughter of a legendary healer and a godly warrior, means a lot to many people, Princess Cecilia. I understand. Cecilia simply nodded, her throat a bit tight. Although she hadn't expected so much hostility when coming here, she also hadn't expected to see people sincerely rooting for her to become queen. I have only gotten a small glimpse of you, so it might be too soon to entirely put my support behind you, said Bastat, but please know you will have nothing to fear from my clan. We will simply be watching. Cecilia understood Bastat's words easily. She was still a foreigner and had merely been here for a few days. Even if she was aware of all the eyes on her, it was too soon for the tribes to really support her. Perhaps she had made an impression at the first banquet, but she would have to prove herself even more in the upcoming days. However, it was understandable that the smaller tribes with lower chances of seeing their candidate become queen would naturally turn to someone who had the power but no tribe supporting her, rather than the candidates from hostile opponents. Cecilia had thought she would have 9 rivals, but perhaps it didn't need to be so. Aside from the girls of the Yekara and Pangaha clans, no other candidates had been openly hostile to her. Perhaps the remaining candidates were also considering this competition very differently as well. Perhaps there were even more eyes watching her than she had realized. You mentioned the king wasn't letting the Yekara clan free the occupied cities anymore, she said, frowning. Then, is he doing it alone? He is, nodded Bastat. That is also why many respect him, or fear him like one would a real god. The king didn't only establish himself because he took the throne by force, but because he managed to remain there without any clan's help, and restored peace at an unprecedented pace all on his own. What about the royal guards? He had defeated the ones his father had previously, so when the White King rose, there was almost none to support him. The Yekara clan helped him defeat the previous royal guards, but there wasn't many left to switch to his side. It took a couple of years before we even got enough new recruits to protect at least the inner capital. Cecilia was rendered speechless. She meant Ashen had reconquered his kingdom almost, on his own? It seemed unthinkable, and yet, it would have explained why all his people worshipped him like a god. He was their war god, the one who had single-handedly saved the decaying Eastern Kingdom. If she put together everything the councillors, Nana and Bastet had told her, their country was an absolute wreck for the past 2 decades. The one king who had first tried to restore some peace had turned out to be a tyrant himself, and the most tribes had fueled the years of civil wars in between. What she had seen so far reflected very little of that. Although she had witnessed the dangers in the outer capital and the ravaged landscape, the capital still seemed to be thriving. The inner capital was completely secure, and the economy was given a new breath, enough for the locals to try and grow more activities, trades, and businesses. All this in the span of just 5 years. Cecilia had always felt something was off about the way people treated Ashen, but now, she knew why. His legend wasn't just a tale he had simply fabricated. It had been forged by his actions, and the miracles he had conceived. Miracles she didn't believe in. Lady Bastet, she suddenly asked, turning to Bastet with a resolute look, do you know which cities were freed recently? I do not, Bastet shook her head. I know. Nana suddenly raised her hand, popping up before them. Sab and some of his friends were chatting about it last week. But why? I want to go. Are you sure? Nana frowned. It's a bit far, and probably not very nice to visit. Cecilia smiled at her and turned to Bastet. Thank you very much for the visit today. I will come to the market again, another time. You will be welcome anytime, Princess Cecilia, Bastet nodded politely. I will have some art pieces delivered to you later if that is all right with you. Thank you. Nana, let's go. All right. Bye, Lady Bastet, thank you for the invite. They quietly left the market, Bastet waving as they exited the little alleys of the market. However, Neptune frowned and got closer to Cecilia. It's not that I don't want to go, but, why are we going there? It's really not a good place to go, even if the king freed that city. The cities usually take a while to get back on their feet and for people to go back there to open trades. If they liberated it last week, it's probably still very, unsightly. I know. That's why I want to go now. Neptune was a bit confused, but she still decided to follow Cecilia quietly, without further discussion. Whatever the princess did, she was always curious to hear and see. It was more interesting than any of her books. So, do you want us to rent horses? If we take really fast horses, maybe we can get there tomorrow morning, but it's still going to be a dangerous journey. I can ask Sabale to come, but it might not be enough. I know Lady Tessa can fight really, really well, but... Don't worry, Nana, chuckled Cecilia. I have the ride and security already covered. Nana frowned for a second, and then she slowly understood, her eyes opening wide and her heart beating a bit faster. She opened and closed her mouth several times, unable to formulate her thoughts. She walked a bit quicker next to Cecilia, only to realize they were going to the Royal Guards training grounds, probably to get Tessandra. Perhaps they were picking her and Sabale up before going to rent horses? However, Cecilia had definitely said the ride was covered. Nana tried hard to contain her excitement, but she was practically jumping when they arrived at the training grounds, not even daring to ask the question that was burning on her lips, which was quite a first. Tessa! Cecilia called once they got there. In the middle of a training field, her cousin was shining. With two short, wooden sticks in her hands, she was defeating her four opponents with incredible ease. When her cousin's voice got to her, she turned her head at the same moment she blocked an attack coming from the opposite side, as if her arm was operating by itself. Then, she turned around, and as if she had been resting until then, she quickly ended the fight about 1 minute later. She was sweating a bit, but compared to the young men with their bodies and egos on the ground, she was fine. She quickly walked up to Cecilia and Nana, Sabale appearing behind her with a faint frown, and a bruise forming next to his chin. "Ceci, Nana! Are you guys back already? How was it?" Tessa asked, a large smile on. "How come you're back already?" "We need to go somewhere," Ceci said. "Now. Got it. Are you coming, handsome?" "I told you to stop calling me that," Sabale blushed. "Where are you girls going?" "To the Muram village," said Nana. "What? Why would you go there?" "We won't be long," promised Cecilia. "We will be back before dusk." Next to her, Nana's eyes sparkled with joy, but her brother had a different opinion. "No way, you're going to take my sister on the dragon," chuckled Tessa. "Come on, babe, you can say it." "Don't call me that either." "I'm sorry, but I can't agree to that. Nana is only 16, she's not going to." "I am not waiting for your permission," his sister exclaimed. "Don't come if you don't want to, but I'm going to ride on Sir Dragon, and you're crazy if you don't come with us too." "Nana! There's enough room for 4, added Tessa with a little wink, putting an arm around Nana's shoulders. "All right, let's go, ladies. Come on, Nana, let's go buy some beignets for the big boy before we go, he'll be happy to have a snack for the road, and I'm hungry too." Cecilia chuckled but turned around to follow Tessandra and Nana, leaving poor Sabale behind. After they had taken a few steps away, they heard an exasperated sigh behind them and steps catching up to them. "By all the gods, you dragon girls are impossible." Again, they borrowed the Dorosafe tribe's passes to get out of the capital and find a deserted area to call out to Cray. This time, Nana was much more enthusiastic than before about leaving the safe area, probably more convinced about both Tessa's skills and having Cray as a bodyguard. The reluctant one was her brother. Although it was obvious he would come with them regardless, he kept protesting as they moved away from the crowded streets and past the two walls, leaving plenty of time for him to banter with Tessandra along the way. Cecilia suspected her cousin was loving those arguments with Sabale, so she and Nana didn't really take part in them. Soon enough, they found themselves in a deserted enough area, and Cecilia called out to the large black dragon. "Couldn't Sir Dragon have come to get us near the castle?" Nana asked, her eyes on the sky. "I don't want too many people to be aware of his presence," Cecilia shook her head. "It's better if he is left alone. I am a bit worried that others will try to hunt him down." "I'm sure Sir Dragon would be fine," Nana exclaimed. "Oh, he would," scoffed Tessa. "We would be more worried about the hunters." Nana grimaced, understanding their point. Despite this, she was a bit excited and nervous to be able to climb on the big dark dragon. She was almost on her toes and trying to glance all around when the dark spot finally appeared in the sky, coming from farther north. Cray let out a loud growl before landing right in front of them, its large wings throwing gusts of wind on all sides. The black dragon looked a bit excited and leaned its head toward Cecilia, who patted the large snout. "Hi," she said with a smile. "I'll climb up first." "Nana, you come after me." "Really?" Nana gasped, smiling from ear to ear. "Your little sister is less scared than you," said Tessandra, teasing Sabale with a little elbow push. "I'm not scared. It's just concern." "Sure." Tessandra helped Nana climb up before doing so herself and offered her hand for Sabale to get on. The young man sighed and rolled his eyes once before eventually sitting behind her. "You'd better hang on," Tessandra warned him with a mischievous smile. To what?" "To me," she exclaimed, frustrated. "Oh, come on, if you can handle a sword, you can grab my waist." Sabale turned red, his eyes going down to Tessandra's waist. Of course, she happened to be wearing a mere piece of fabric around her chest, meaning a lot of skin was exposed below that. He sighed but finally wrapped his arms around her, trying to look elsewhere. Finally, Tessandra smiled. "Nana, you hang on too. Come on, Cray, let's go." The dragon jumped up in the sky effortlessly, despite the 4 humans it carried. Nana gasped, letting out something between a squeak and a cry, but in a matter of seconds, and despite the fear, she found herself mesmerized by the view below. The capital was growing tinier each second, while the large, flapping wings were taking them high, fast. The dragon was climbing up, and even Sabale had to hang on tighter to Tessandra, much to her satisfaction. Thankfully for Sabale, Cray quickly found a nice pace at which to fly. The dragon could float a bit with its wings spread wide open, and at this height, it was incredibly easy for them to get away from the capital. Quickly, Nana had to point at the place they were headed to, almost like she would have pointed it out on a map. Still, she enjoyed each second of the flight. She had never seen her country like this, nor imagined the sensations flying could give them. It was scary but thrilling. However, because it was her home country she could observe from up there, it was also saddening to see all the ruined, burnt, deserted lands. 2 of my uncles and our grandfather died in the civil wars, she whispered to Ceci with a sad voice. It was really hard, for a while. I was scared every day that people would ransack our house next. My dad said we survived because we were able to stay together and protect our boats, but we knew what was happening everywhere else. It was worse when the army came back defeated from the border. People don't like to say it, but many of the people who became mercenaries were soldiers before that. After they lost the war, there was no money to pay them, and they didn't want to return to their families empty-handed. It became really horrible. Even those who returned to their villages ended up having to fight to defend them. Cecilia felt her pain as well. She had accompanied her father on battlefields, and her mother in hospitals. She knew how to recognize traces of war and devastation. When Cray finally landed them in front of the Muram village, a terrible smell of burnt flesh greeted them. Nana grimaced and covered her nose, hiding behind Cecilia, a bit afraid once again. They all got down from the black dragon, which growled, also unhappy about this place. Cray wasn't the only one. This village didn't look like it had been freed, it looked like a cemetery. There were only a few people who ran to hide upon the dragon's arrival. Cecilia gestured for Cray to stay behind, the dragon lying down, and she stepped forward first, the others following right behind her. "This place is," grimaced Tessandra, visibly just as disgusted. The smell was coming from the large pile of bodies on the side. Most of it had been turned to charcoal black, but there was just so much that it wouldn't go away for a few more days. Cecilia couldn't bear to look at the calcined human remains. They had been gathered a bit away from what was left of the Muram village. It was really just a village like any other. A handful of roads came to a group of modest houses, and there were only 2 shops, both closed. In fact, all buildings bore traces of damage of some sort. Some had holes in the walls, others their door ripped off, and one even seemed to have completely collapsed from the inside. Those weren't new, however. A lot of the damage had clearly been done over a few years. Only the large red stains on the walls and ground seemed to be fairly new. Cecilia kept looking around the streets, ignoring all the stares she could feel on her from behind the closed doors and drawn curtains. "Some of the royal guards came here just a few days ago with the king," said Sabale, "to help gather the bodies, and try to help with the damages, but many villagers don't trust soldiers anymore, since what happened with the previous king. They were asked to leave by the remaining locals." Tessandra crouched down, her eyes on the ground. She was scrutinizing all the footprints left on the soil, and behind her, Cecilia was standing but staring at them too. "How many soldiers came to fight?" Tessandra asked. "I'm not sure. Maybe about 20 or 30. Sabale shrugged. "Why? It doesn't look like there was much of a fight," Cecilia said. "Even if the battle had ended a week ago, there weren't many people there, and the houses were rather far from one another since this place was meant for farming. From her experience, there should have been much more traces of the fight than this. His Majesty arrived first and did most of the work," explained Sabale. "His abilities are godly. When the royal soldiers arrive, there usually isn't much more to do about the pillagers. We come to pacify the people, help with the damage, and make sure the place will remain peaceful." "Peaceful, it is," scoffed Tessandra. Indeed, there was a terrible silence reigning. A silence of death. Cecilia's eyes turned to the houses. Most of them had found people to come back and live in them. These lands were obviously meant to be farmed, but it would take months before people could do anything with them again. The soil hadn't been cultivated for far too long, and all the animals had fled. The only well was probably dry too. She sighed, a bit depressed. The aftermath of a battle never had a taste of victory. What now, Ceci? What did we come here for? I want to know how the king did it, she said. She turned around and began walking to the pile of bodies. Her eyes were going to the damaged walls, analyzing everything she saw. She knew the survivors would probably not talk to a foreign woman who had just landed on a dragon's back, and she couldn't blame them for being terrified. They were probably terrorized already. Behind her, Nana was following like a shadow. From a dreamlike flight, her mood had sunk with the heavy atmosphere in this place, and she didn't really dare leave the princess' side. She was also curious to understand why Cecilia had wanted to come here. Meanwhile, Tessandra stayed behind, observing the traces of the fight. Between the two, Sabale, visibly lost, crossed his arms. I told you, the king came first. Seeing that Cecilia didn't seem to listen, he ran to catch up to her. I've seen him in action, he continued. The king has unbelievable fighting skills, the best in our entire kingdom, and he's as fast as lightning. Behind him, all soldiers become braver just from seeing him in action. We all dream to achieve a tenth of his talent one day. His white hair is proof he is out of this world, and his combat skills too. It's inhuman. I really believe his sword is blessed by the gods of war. Your king only had one god of war training him, retorted Cecilia, sounding angry, and he did not teach him this. She stopped in front of the pile of bodies, a dejected expression on her face. Somewhere behind her, Nana hadn't followed her all the way and was covering her nose with her sleeve, looking like she was going to be sick. Sabale only dared to go a couple of steps farther than his sister, but before he added anything, Cecilia's hand suddenly grabbed a limb from one of the bodies and pulled it to take it out of the pile. He gasped in shock, not only because of the visual of the burnt bodies falling down one after another but because she had fearlessly grabbed a still smoking corpse. So much of the flesh was already burnt that it looked like Cecilia had dragged a skeleton away from the pile in front of the siblings' shocked eyes. Her dark reptilian hand was protecting her from the heat, but there was nothing to prevent the smell. Neptune coughed a bit but didn't dare try to get closer. Tessandra was the one to join her cousin, glaring at the body beneath them. This guy was killed in one blow, she said, tilting her head. The way his neck bones are still bent means the sword was stopped halfway, probably by some armor. A grown adult, I'd say. Cecilia seemed to be scrutinizing the body from even closer. She didn't shy away from getting down on her knees next to it or manipulating it, although she was visibly being as respectful as possible. She used her scaled hand to check the body's mouth and its head, although there wasn't much left but a few holes and the vague shape of a skull. He was drugged, she whispered. What? His tongue and gums burned faster than they should have, compared to the rest of his body. There was something that accelerated the process in his mouth. Alcohol. He doesn't smell like alcohol. Tessa leaned over, and despite grimacing, took a whiff of the body, before nodding. You're right. Alcohol would still leave a smell, I can even smell some of his sweat. What kind of nose have you got? Exclaimed Sabale, stunned. A dragon's, the girls answered simultaneously. Somewhere behind them, Cray let out a short growl, as if to concur. Sabale was speechless. The princess could tell the person was drugged simply after observing their burnt body? Before he could even ask anything, she and Tessandra began pulling two more bodies out and observing them the same way. The two cousins were quickly drawing conclusions between themselves, agreeing those people had been killed way too swiftly. Someone drugged these people before they fought, mumbled Tessandra. That guy looked like he had plenty of muscle, but he was killed with one blow. They probably all were. There are, what, 50 bodies here? 66, my lady. They turned around. A very old woman, who only stood with the help of a cane, had come out of one of the houses to talk to them. She was wearing a bandage with blood on it over her small head and looked like she had been. As if her body was moving automatically, Cecilia walked up to her, gently pulling the bandage to see the wound beneath. I can treat this, she offered. I am fine, young lady, the old woman shook her head, but thank you. I'm at the age where I don't care about these little things anymore. I heard you ladies from my house, the one over there. You were right. All these men were drugged before His Majesty arrived. We did it. What the heck? Tessandra frowned. Why? To help His Majesty, exclaimed the old lady. This village was my ancestors' home long before those bandits came here. I had to watch again and again as they robbed, killed, and raped every single person I have known. They killed my sons who tried to save me, and they raped my daughter-in-law and grandchild before murdering them. Each time more men came here, it wasn't to save us, it was more bandits coming to take whatever was left. The old lady looked exhausted just from saying all that. In fact, she seemed to be out of energy overall. She was old, injured, and clearly very upset too. Her wrinkled hand was shaking on her cane, and tears were appearing in her small eyes. Cecilia felt her own throat tighten listening to all this. She could imagine that pain was the pain of each person hiding inside the houses. No wonder they had been terrified of them and their dragon now. Granny, I'm so sorry, Nana cried, upset as well. I can't take any more pity, young lady, said the old woman. Those men got what they deserved. They weren't humans. I don't know what you came here for, but the king served justice for my family. Did you see the fight, old lady? Asked Tessandra, her hands on her hips. From behind my window, she nodded. I would have helped, even. There were 66 bandits here. That's what I said. And you drugged them all to help the king. The old lady suddenly seemed to calm down a bit, and averted her eyes, nodding. We did. The few of us they kept alive to serve them, cook them meals. We simply drugged them, to help His Majesty. How did you know the king was coming? The old lady hesitated for a second, before shrugging. We had heard he was on his way. From whom? If the bandits had known, they should have been prepared better than stupidly eating and drinking homemade drugs by a bunch of villagers. Watch your tongue, foreigner, exclaimed the elder. You're the one not telling us the truth. I'm not lying. We drugged them. Who provided you the drugs? Asked Cecilia, frowning too. Who told you the king was coming? I told you, no one. We made it. You don't have the ingredients here to make such a potent and complicated drug, she retorted. Someone had to come beforehand and tell you this plan. The king had an easy fight against those bandits because you helped him. I just want to know who helped you." The old woman seemed to hesitate, her eyes going to Nana behind them. Seeing she still wasn't talking, Neptune took a deep breath and came forward. "Granny, please? We are on His Majesty's side too. We came from the capital to understand what happened here. We will help you, I promise. I will ask my uncle to bring you some food, as soon as we can. Look. See? It's a pass from my family, the Dorosave tribe. We can help you, I promise." The old woman's eyes lingered for a while on Neptune's papers, her lips pinched in a line. Then, she sighed. "That woman. She asked us not to tell anyone about the drug, but since you already know. I don't know more, anyway. She just snuck into the village the night before the king arrived, and gave us a huge bag that smelled like herbal medicine, asking us to put it in their food." "A woman?" Tessa frowned. "Yes. She had strangely pale skin just like yours, and red hair too." Cecilia and Tessandra exchanged a look. The latter sighed. "Oh well, that explains a couple of things, although it makes me mad too. Why all the questions? What are you here for?" the older woman exclaimed, frowning. "With that dragon, I thought you had come to attack us." "Why would we attack here? There's literally nothing left we'd possibly want to steal." "Tessa." "My thoughts too," scoffed the granny, not offended. "We only came because we heard what happened here," sighed Cecilia. "I am a healer. Are you sure you don't want me to look at your wounds?" "Oh, if that's the case. There are a few more who need it more than me. The soldiers did their best, but those brave boys aren't cut out to heal anything. If that's all right with you, I'll go back to the others now and explain to them. We'll see if they want to be healed by a foreigner or not." "Thank you." Cecilia nodded. The old lady slowly went back, and Cecilia let out a long sigh, crossing her arms. Tessandra walked up to her, a sullen look also. "What are you thinking? Are you mad that the king had help?" "I don't know." Cecilia was conflicted. Her eyes kept going back to the pile of bodies. Even though she now knew who they were and what they had done, she still felt something was terribly wrong about all of this. She didn't like the idea that Giselle had cheated the battle in Ashen's favor, either, but she knew this had probably spared him, and a lot of the soldiers, some wounds and effort. Perhaps it had even saved lives. "This is too horrible," muttered Neptune, still upset. To think those people were still under those bandits' tyranny all this time. "It makes me sick just thinking about what that granny had to go through." "Don't think too much," sighed Tessandra. "You getting sick won't help them. Can your tribe really provide food here?" "We can," nodded Sabale. "I'll make sure of it." "Great. But I doubt the Dorosave can feed all the other villages in the same situation." Cecilia felt the same. Even if the Dorosave provided some help, it would be temporary, not a long-term solution. She looked around. They had to help those people so they would get back on their feet by themselves. First, as she had promised, Cecilia spent time looking at the wounds of the people the old woman brought forward to meet her. They were clearly lacking the proper medicine and supplies, so they had to make do with what they had, as well as explain to them how to tend to the most basic wounds, sterilize things, and create their own supplies. Not only her, but Tessandra, who had also learned some rudimentary medicine, helped too. There weren't many people left to tend to, but they did their best. Even Neptune was happy to run errands, distribute some snacks she had gotten earlier that day from her aunt, and learn what she could from Cecilia. It was clear her thirst for knowledge knew no bounds, and she even quickly got over her disgust of blood and exposed flesh to help out. Meanwhile, Sabale was recruited to help repair the damages, unplug the well, and gather what materials could still be useful. It was cute to see him run around, eager to help and eager to get out of a certain lady's line of sight.